The lights dimmed, the crowd settled, and the cameras began to roll as Sylvester Stallone walked into the studio of The Real Word with Martin Chase. The action star moved with his usual quiet confidence, his step steady, his expression unreadable. The audience erupted into applause, but Stallone barely acknowledged it. He was here for a conversation, not a performance. Martin Chase leaned back in his chair, smirking. He had done this before, baiting guests, trapping them with his questions, twisting words to create headlines. Tonight, he had his next target. Stallone took his seat, adjusted his jacket, glanced at Chase, then at the crowd. Something felt off. Chase wasted no time. "Sylvester, let's be honest. You're known for playing the same tough guy in every film. Do you ever wonder if Hollywood sees you as anything more than an action figure? Someone just there to throw punches, not someone with real talent?" The audience tensed. Some chuckled, expecting Stallone to fire back. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the hostility. Stallone did not react. No shift in posture, no change in expression. His eyes locked onto Chase. Chase smirked, mistaking Stallone's silence for hesitation. But the crowd could feel it. This was not hesitation. This was calculation. Stallone folded his hands together and leaned forward ever so slightly. The energy in the room shifted. The host had fired the first shot, but everyone could see it now. Sylvester Stallone was not the one in the corner. What happened next would leave the world speechless. Before continuing, like and subscribe to catch Sylvester Stallone's powerful face-off with Martin Chase, and comment where you're watching from today. The studio lights dimmed just slightly, casting a warm glow across the glossy floor of the CBS soundstage in Manhattan. The audience, a mix of longtime fans, working-class folks, retired military, and everyday Americans with creases on their brows and stories in their bones, settled into a hush. The red cue light above the camera flickered on, and a voice from behind the curtain announced the guest with reverence and weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvester Stallone." Applause erupted like a wave crashing against a seawall. Not polite clapping, but the kind that rises from decades of admiration, of seeing yourself in a man who never stayed down. Stallone stepped into the light, not rushing, not performing, but simply arriving. His movements were slow, deliberate, not because of age, but because every step carried history. He wore a dark, fitted blazer, a plain black shirt beneath it, dark jeans, and scuffed boots that had seen more years than most of the staff running cables offstage. His eyes scanned the crowd briefly, not for validation, not for applause, but to acknowledge them, human to human. Then he turned his gaze to the man seated center stage, Martin Chase. Martin was every bit the polished host. Slick hair, designer suit, Italian leather shoes that hadn't touched a sidewalk in years. He smiled like a man who had waited a long time for this particular interview. Known across the country for his cutting questions and smug superiority, Martin had a reputation for making powerful people squirm. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, index finger tapping cue cards on his knee. He'd spent days preparing for this one, not because he admired Stallone, but because he didn't. And tonight, he wanted to expose the myth. Stallone took his seat without a word, adjusted his jacket with a firm tug, and folded his hands on his lap. He didn't bounce his knee, didn't glance at the camera, just stared at Martin like a man who had walked through fire and now stood calmly in the smoke. Martin wasted no time. "Sylvester," he began, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's be honest. You've built a career playing the same guy. The grizzled underdog. The wounded tough guy. Do you ever wonder if Hollywood sees you as anything more than a relic? A living action figure? Someone who throws punches, but never really says much?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience, but most sat still, unsure if they were meant to laugh. Martin pressed on. "Don't get me wrong. We all love Rocky. But you've done what? 8 of them? Then Rambo. Then The Expendables. There's a pattern. You ever feel like you're just repeating yourself because you don't know how to evolve?" Stallone didn't blink. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't even breathe differently. His eyes locked onto Martin's, steady and unreadable. Martin smiled wider, mistaking silence for surrender. "I mean, look at actors like Daniel Day-Lewis or Christian Bale. They disappear into their roles. You, on the other hand, you play yourself. Over and over. A guy with a mumble and a right hook. Does it ever make you feel like maybe you're not respected?" The word hung in the air like smoke. The audience stirred again. Some leaned forward, sensing something was about to happen. Stallone leaned in just a touch. Then he spoke. "You done?" The words came low, gravelly, like distant thunder. Martin chuckled casually. "It's just a question, Sly." Stallone nodded slowly. "Okay, now let me ask you something." He placed his hands together and locked his fingers. "You ever eat dinner in a hallway, Martin?" Martin blinked. "Sorry?" "Because there was no table, no kitchen, just a one-bedroom you shared with 4 people. You ever watch your mother work double shifts until her hands cracked? You ever sell your dog because you couldn't afford to feed him?" The room went still. Even the camera crew froze. "That's not a script," Stallone said. "That was my 20s. You talk about roles. I wasn't acting. I was surviving." Martin tried to interject, but Stallone continued, his voice calm, deliberate. "You think I play the same guy in every movie? Maybe I do. But you ever wonder why people keep showing up to watch that guy? It's not nostalgia. It's because they see something in him. A reflection, a reminder, of someone who refuses to quit, who doesn't win by being clever or lucky, but by getting up when everything says stay down." Martin licked his lips, shuffled his cue cards. "Look, I get it. You've been through things. But don't you think at some point you could have pushed yourself more? Tried something deeper?" Stallone raised an eyebrow. "Deeper?" He let the word sit. "Let me tell you something, Martin. You sit here in a $2,000 suit, in a chair you didn't build, asking questions someone else wrote, in a room you didn't pay for. And you think I haven't gone deep?" He leaned forward. "You ever have your script rejected by every studio in town because they said your face wouldn't sell tickets? You ever sleep in a bus terminal, holding on to a dream so tight it hurts to breathe? You ever write a character, not to win awards, but just to make people believe they weren't alone?" The applause started slow, one pair of hands in the back, then another. But Stallone didn't acknowledge it. He stared at Martin, eyes steady. "You call me a relic? Maybe. But I'm still here. I didn't get here by accident. I bled for every inch of this seat. And the people who come to see me, they didn't come to be dazzled. They came to remember they matter." The crowd now was with him. Martin tried one more time. "But don't you think your age is proof I survived?" Stallone cut in. "I'm still standing, and that's more than most can say." He sat back, folded his hands again, and went silent. Martin had more cue cards, more questions, But none of them mattered now. The energy in the room had shifted. For the first time, Martin Chase looked small in his own studio. And Sylvester Stallone, he hadn't just answered the question. He'd reminded everyone why he was still standing. Martin Chase sat a little stiffer in his chair now, his fingers no longer tapping casually against the stack of cue cards beside him. His smirk had faded, not entirely gone, but shrinking into something that looked more like discomfort than amusement. The audience had sensed it long before he did. The shift, the moment when this interview stopped being his game and became something else entirely. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some control, something familiar, something rehearsed. Sylvester, I respect your experience truly, but don't you think sometimes, just sometimes, that maybe the industry handed you a stage that others never got? That maybe the myth of you became bigger than your actual range as an actor? Stallone didn't move. He didn't blink. He waited a full beat longer than polite conversation normally allowed, then spoke, quiet but firm. You ever grow up being told you're too stupid to be taken seriously? That your speech was a joke? That your face was wrong for the screen? I didn't walk onto a stage someone built for me. I built the damn stage. With my own words, with rejection slips in my mailbox, with the echo of every casting agent who laughed me out of their office. He glanced at the crowd now, not for approval, not for applause, but as if he was reminding them, and himself, that this was not just about him. You know what the problem is, Martin? You've confused survival with privilege. I didn't get here because I was lucky. I got here because I had no other choice. I fought for every line I ever said, every paycheck I ever earned, every ounce of respect that came decades after the first insult. Martin shifted again, trying to insert a new line of questioning, but it was too late. The thread had been pulled. Stallone was not reacting. He was leading. You think my movies are about violence? You think I play the same guy in every story? Maybe. But maybe that guy matters. Maybe the reason people still show up to see me is because they see someone who doesn't pretend to be something he's not. Someone who wears his scars, not his costume, but his memory. The audience stayed silent, hanging on every word. Stallone turned back to Martin. Let me ask you something else, Martin. When was the last time you got hit in the face? Martin blinked. Excuse me? Not metaphorically. Not online. I mean, really hit. Knocked down so hard you had to decide whether to stand back up or stay down. Because I've had that. In alleys. In gyms. In life. And every time, I got back up. Not because it made for a good movie. Because it was the only way forward. A man in the second row let out a quiet, "Yeah," under his breath. Martin tried to smile. It didn't land. He looked to the teleprompter, then the floor manager off stage, then back to Stallone. But what about range, Sylvester? Don't you ever wish you'd been cast in roles that pushed you in new directions? Stallone shrugged. Pushed me? He leaned forward slightly. You know what pushes a man. Feeding a family on nothing. Watching your firstborn come into the world when you can't afford a crib. Spending your last dollar to print a script no one wants. That's pressure. That's transformation. That's range. He let the words sit in the space between them. You want me to speak with an accent? Put on a wig? Change my gait? Or do you want me to speak from a life I actually lived? Martin reached for a new card, his fingers fumbling slightly. Well, people admire your background, of course. The struggles, the story. It's almost cinematic. Stallone raised an eyebrow. Almost. Martin chuckled nervously. What I mean is, some critics say that maybe it was luck. Right place, right time. A good story. You grew up poor. You had the face, the body, the voice. Maybe the industry needed a working-class hero, and you were there to fill the void. The crowd didn't make a sound. It was the kind of statement that landed like a slap. Not just to Stallone, but to everyone who had ever clawed their way out of nowhere and been told it was all just luck. Stallone didn't show anger. He just breathed slowly, as if exhaling history. You ever been poor, Martin? His voice didn't change, but the tone had steel in it. Not broke. I mean poor. The kind of poor where you carry shame like a second skin. Where you're invisible until someone wants to use your pain for a headline. Martin swallowed. I've faced challenges, sure. No, Stallone said, not harshly, but with finality. You've observed them. There's a difference. He straightened slightly. You talk about my background like it's a lucky twist in a screenplay. But you know what I see when I look back? I see a boy who was told he'd never matter. I see rejection. I see nights in the cold. I see people crossing the street to avoid me. And I see a man who never let any of that define him. Martin looked smaller now, his voice thinner. But don't you think you're an exception? Stallone looked him dead in the eye. I think there are millions of people out there who never had a microphone or a camera pointed at them. People tougher than me, stronger than me, smarter than me. And they're stuck in jobs they hate, in lives they didn't choose, because no one ever gave them a chance. If I represent anything, it's them. That's when the applause returned. Not a roar, but a swell, like water rising. People clapping not just for the man in the chair, but for themselves, for what they'd survived, what they'd fought for, what they still hoped for. Stallone waited, let it pass through the room like a wave. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just let them have their moment. Martin cleared his throat again, quieter now. So what do you want to be remembered for? Stallone paused. His gaze shifted upward, somewhere far beyond the rafters. Then he looked back down, not at Martin, but at the lens. At the audience. At the people watching from living rooms, and back porches, and second jobs on break. I want to be remembered as someone who didn't give up. Someone who didn't lie about who he was. Someone who stood for the kind of people this industry forgets. The people who get hit and get up anyway. And with that, the room fell silent again. No cue cards, no rehearsed transitions, just truth, raw and undiluted. The camera zoomed in slowly, catching every line on his face, every wrinkle earned, not given. And across from him, Martin Chase finally understood. This wasn't an interview. This was a reckoning. Martin Chase sat in silence, his mouth slightly open, his eyes flickering with thoughts he couldn't quite turn into words. It was rare for him to be this still, this unsure. But the weight of what had just been said pressed down on the entire room like a heavy fog. The usual rhythm of the show, question, answer, clever remark, applause, had evaporated. In its place was something much harder to control. Reality, the kind that didn't care about commercial breaks or clever editing. Stallone hadn't just spoken. He'd stripped something bare, not just in himself, but in everyone watching. Martin cleared his throat again, but this time it wasn't to interrupt. It was to steady himself. Sylvester, he began, his voice lower, I've done hundreds of interviews. I've had presidents, billionaires, Oscar winners sitting across from me. But I don't think I've ever felt this. He stopped, searching for the right word. Small? Stallone offered. Not harshly, just honestly. Martin gave a breath of a chuckle. Yeah, that. He set down his cards now, all of them, like a gambler folding a bad hand. I came into this thinking I'd ask you hard questions, make you uncomfortable, maybe shake a myth or two. But you didn't dodge a thing. You just stood your ground. Stallone nodded slightly. That's what I've always done. Martin looked down for a moment, then back up. Why do you think that matters so much to people? Why do they keep showing up for you, decade after decade? Stallone leaned back in his chair, not with arrogance, but like a man finally allowed to rest for a moment. Because I don't pretend to be perfect. I never had to transform into a character. I was already living it. Every time I got knocked down on screen, it reminded people of the times they got knocked down in life. When Rocky got up, they got up too. And when I stood in front of a crowd, mumbling through my lines, too stiff, too raw, too real, they saw that maybe they didn't have to be polished either, just honest, just willing. The studio was completely still, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of memories, of personal battles revisited, of quiet understanding shared across strangers. Then Martin said something no one expected. Do you think people like me, people who've never had to fight like that, do we get it wrong? Stallone didn't answer right away. He looked at Martin like a teacher might look at a student who finally asked the right question, not to be clever, but to learn. I don't think it's about right or wrong, he said. It's about seeing, really seeing. Most people go their whole lives avoiding pain, avoiding struggle. But the ones who've been through it, they wear it. Not like shame, but like armor. And sometimes people who haven't been through it, they don't mean to be cruel. They just don't know what it looks like to survive without a safety net. Martin sat very still. So what now? He asked quietly. Stallone looked around the studio, at the cameras, the lights, the faces watching him. Now, he said, now I walk out of here the same way I walked in, honest, quiet, knowing I spoke what needed to be said. He stood, slowly, his body still strong but carrying decades of effort. He reached up and unclipped his mic, placing it gently on the table, like a man laying down a weapon. The room didn't erupt in applause, not yet. It just watched. Watched as this man, who had played fighters his whole life, showed them what a real fight looked like. Not in the ring, but in rooms like this. As he turned to leave, Martin stood up too. Wait, he said. Stallone stopped, turned, met his eyes. Martin took a breath. I was wrong about you, about what matters. Thank you for not just showing up, but for standing tall. Stallone gave a small nod. No smile, just respect. Take care, Martin. He turned again, walking toward the stage exit. And that's when it started. A single pair of hands clapping, then another, then more, until the studio was filled with the sound of people standing, applauding, not for a celebrity, but for a man who had shown them something they hadn't expected to find tonight. Truth. Raw, imperfect, unwavering truth. The camera stayed on him as he walked away. No music, no cut to commercial. Just the image of a man leaving quietly after saying everything that mattered. And behind him, at his desk, Martin Chase sat staring at nothing, his cue cards untouched, his voice silent, as if the noise of applause had crowded out every scripted word. Later, when the footage aired, the network would try to trim it down, cut the silences, smooth the pacing, maybe squeeze in a sponsor's message, but the audience wouldn't let them. The clip went viral before the credits even rolled. Not because Stallone said something outrageous, not because he shocked anyone, but because he told the truth in a room built for performance. And for days, weeks, even months after, people would comment on that look Martin had at the end. The look of a man who realized that for all his cleverness, all his research, and lines and timing, he had come face to face with something far more powerful than any punchline: dignity. A quiet, worn, unapologetic dignity that didn't need to shout to be heard. And Sylvester Stallone? He didn't tweet about it, didn't issue a follow-up statement. He just went back to his life, back to work, back to writing, back to walking like a man who had lived every moment of his story and carried it without shame. Because some men act, and some men simply are. And sometimes the quietest moments leave the loudest echoes.